Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes here. While you're waiting, if you want to go ahead and go on Canvas and pull up the same PowerPoint that we have been using, if you already downloaded it to your computer, you can open it up from there. Same PowerPoint, we're going to pick up where we left off last time. You can get that ready to go. Okay, so we got about 18 people in here. It is 7:40, so I am going to get started. So go ahead, if you haven't done so already, and open up that PowerPoint on Unit 1. We are going to pick up on slide 18, which is dealing with the Greek philosophers. So we're still talking about the origins of democracy. Hello there, Arnav. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We've been talking about ancient Greece, and we've been talking about the origins of democracy, particularly in Athens. And the last time that we met, we finished up talking about three major reformers of Athens who started to implement slightly more democratic processes to government to widen the number of people that were able to participate in the Athenian democracy. Now, remember that the Athenian democracy is going to be slightly different from American democracy in that they are voting directly on laws. This is called a direct democracy. That's different from our democracy. We typically don't vote directly on laws. We vote for representatives. That is more of it's called a republic or a representative democracy, where we don't vote directly on laws because a lot of the laws that are put through, or the bills that are being voted on to become laws. Hi there, Gareth. Welcome. So here's the thing about laws, right? In order for a law to become a law, it has to be written first, and it's a bill first before it becomes a law. A lot of these bills that get written by legislators in Congress, and Congress is simply the legislative body that we use. We vote people into both the federal and the state legislatures, and our Congress is the federal legislature. Legislature is just a fancy word for lawmaking body. So what do? They make laws. And in our legislature, the way that ours works, it's a two-house legislature. And so we have a lower house and an upper house. And in order for a bill to get passed, it has to be voted on by the lower house, pass, and then once that first step is completed, it gets sent on to the upper house, the Senate, and that gets voted on a second time. They make changes or whatever, then they vote on it again. If it passes, then it goes to the president, who then can veto it or sign it into law. But a lot of the bills that get written by lawmakers, who are frequently lawyers, they usually have advanced degrees in law, political science, history, maybe, things like that. These laws can be very lengthy, and laws get voted on all the time. It's not like the president, where you come out and vote every 4 years. So if we had a direct democracy here in the United States, to be honest with you, it really wouldn't work that well. Already, once every 4 years is a lot for people to show up and vote. And frankly, there's even more elections than that when you consider midterms and other things like that to vote on representatives at the House or Senate level. The thing about this, though, is that people don't really have the time, and frankly, they don't really have the education necessary to be able to make good decisions on voting on laws. We're talking about extremely complex documents that your average person really isn't going to understand, much less have the time to read it or then go vote on it. So direct democracy really doesn't work that well here in the United States, where we have upwards of 300 and some million people, and it would be a logistical nightmare. So we don't employ a direct democracy. Or the closest thing that we get here in California, at least, is to vote on props, and really that's only a handful of issues that show up every few years on the ballot. Certainly nowhere near the number of laws that get passed, in the meantime. So, in Greece today, we are picking up the other thing that we talked about last class, just to remind you, is we talked about the major reformers who made these laws to widen the franchise. In other words, widen the number of people who have the ability to participate in government. And we talked about the Council of 500 under Cleisthenes and Pericles, how he widened democracy still. But the thing about this, though, that you have to keep in mind is that still it's not quite the level of engagement that our modern democracy has. It's still a pretty limited democracy, and there's only a handful of people that are really able to participate and make decisions in the Athenian democracy, and women weren't included in that. Slaves were not included in that. You had to essentially be a male citizen, and a lot of times there were other, throughout history there have been other requirements too, about land ownership or social status or other things like that, to be able to participate in a democratic type government. Now here we've widened it quite a bit in the last however many years. to include all sorts of folks. And so we have one of the broadest, participation in government in terms of we allow essentially any citizen, regardless of gender or race or whatever. Really, the only qualifications are you have to be a citizen, you have to be of age. So today we're moving on to talk about the Greek philosophers, and these are different than the reformers. The philosophers are thinkers, okay? The reformers are more like statesmen. They're like politicians. They serve in some capacity in government. These philosophers don't have a governmental role necessarily, but nonetheless, they're very important figures because they're thinking about the world. And the Greek philosophers, you've probably heard their names before. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are the three Greek philosophers that we will be discussing today. And so if you could go ahead and switch over to that PowerPoint and have that pulled up, and we'll go ahead and start looking through this. So the first slide there says Greek philosophers. We're on slide 18 out of 84. What does a philosopher do? They think about natural laws using reason. So they look at the world around them, they ask questions about the world around them, and they're contemplating the world around them, right? And so let's talk a little bit about logic and reason. In the 4th century BC, that's the 300s, think of it on a number line. If 0 on your number line go before 0 to the left of 0, and now we're dealing with like negative numbers. So we're roughly about 300 years before Jesus in the time area that we're talking about. And they used logic and reason to investigate the nature of the universe, to investigate human society, to investigate morality, what's a moral decision, ethical decisions, and so on. And they based their thinking on 2 assumptions, okay? The first being that the universe, in which to them included the land, the sky, and the sea, was put together in an orderly way and is subject to absolute and unchanging laws, that the world functions in a known, predictable way. All right. Now, it's going to be a while before that idea is really accepted wholeheartedly by the entire planet. Right. Now, there's still some things in science that we can't figure out, like how to travel at light speed or something like that. All right, but there's the fact of the matter is that there are a whole lot of things that we see happen in nature that there's a perfectly rational explanation for. There's a way of explaining how, for example, biology works, or there's a way of, for example, of how chemistry or physics works. Okay, and that pretty much no matter what, we have ways of explaining using scientific procedures. All sorts of phenomena that happen across the universe. And then the second assumption that these guys make is that people can understand how the world works using logic and reason. Now, this is a tricky thing because, we're still dealing a very long time ago in ancient times. And so whereas these people, these philosophers, and the people who are their students and so on, are questioning the world and using logic to try to explain what they see happen around them. Keep in mind, we are living in ancient times. They haven't lived through the scientific revolution, for example. Okay, they don't know about Isaac Newton or gravity or things like that. All right, they're trying to explain the world by questioning the world and using logic and reason, but they don't have all of the tools in their repertoire to be able to question the world in the way that a modern person would be able to question the world using science and various methods and procedures. All right, so they're doing it based virtually just on thinking, which is itself kind of admirable that they're attempting to make sense of the universe in a time where a lot of the scientific procedures and stuff just frankly don't exist. And this idea of of being a philosopher, of questioning and challenging the world, is a key ingredient of a democratic society. We want to be challenging the assumptions that we have. We want to be challenging known phenomena and trying to disprove things. Now, I will say with one caveat that I think that in modern day times, this can be taken to a bit of an extreme, questioning things that don't really need to be questioned anymore. They've been figured out for a long time. I don't even need to mention things like the flat earther thing from a couple of years ago, where people, I don't even know if that's a real thing or if it's just the largest troll in internet history, but there's no need to question if the earth is flat. We have the answers to that. We don't need to be challenging things that have been known, okay, for a long time. And other things too. There's a lot of things that people start to become skeptical about, and I think it's kind of misplaced skepticism. There's good things to be skeptical about, and then there's things that you're kind of wasting your time being skeptical about. And Arnav, no, you cannot. Now, and I'm not even going to engage in that because it's just preposterous and ridiculous. Now, let's move forward to the next slide. We're now on slide 20. Ancient Greek philosophers, three major philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, lived in Athens in the 400s and 300s BC, and they laid the foundation for philosophy for the next several centuries, really. Now, one of the things that happens here, folks, that you really do need to be aware of is that we go through a period of time. So we're still in the ancient times right now, okay? But very quickly here, as we move into the second unit of this class in a couple weeks here, all right, we're going to be jumping ahead a long way and skipping over a significant period of time in history, roughly about 1,000 years, because this class doesn't focus too much on a period of time in history known as the Dark Ages, okay, or the Middle Ages or the medieval era. We don't focus a lot on the medieval era because there's actually a lot of reasons that aren't very good ones in my book, but not that it's not important. I think that the Dark Ages are a very cool and important time to study, but the state of California doesn't really emphasize that part of history for a 10th grade class. And so because it's not really something that's emphasized, we don't spend a whole lot of time looking at the Middle Ages in here. But I'm going to take a second to talk about it right now for the sake of having you get a little bit of an appreciation for how the world and humanity in general kind of went through a period of time of darkness. So intellectual darkness. I don't mean like physical darkness, but intellectual darkness. So here's essentially what happens. The Roman Empire is going to be the next major thing that we talk about after the Greek philosophers. And the Roman Empire starts right around the same time. Actually, the Roman Empire, if you think of it as kind of like rising and falling stars, the ancient Greek civilization was kind of a dying star right about the same time that the Roman Empire was a rising star. So they do like marginally eclipse one another and exist roughly around the same time, but one's kind of dying out and one's just getting started. And so the Roman Empire comes to power. The Roman Empire was this empire that lasted for roughly 1,000 years. And as we move forward here, the Romans, adopted a lot of Greek ideas and were inspired by some Greek art and other things like that. But when the Roman Empire falls, so the Western Roman Empire, situated in Rome, which is in Italy, fell in about the year 450 or so AD, so 450 years after Jesus. Okay. AD, remember, means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. Sometimes historians now call it just the Common Era. Anyhow, I'm kind of going on a tangent here. Let me get back to the point that I'm trying to make. We're talking about philosophy today. The Romans were very interested in philosophy too, and thinking and so on. And there are Roman thinkers and philosophers and writers and poets and literary figures and so on. After the rise of Christianity, the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, there was an emperor in Rome. His name was Emperor Constantine. And in 360 AD, he officially made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. Now, something to keep in mind about the Romans is that they are inherently very superstitious. So although they are thinkers and they have a huge empire and they're very successful in conquering and administering their massive empire, what ultimately ends up happening is the Roman Empire gets a little bit too large to be able to effectively administer, and it falls. And the Emperor Constantine ended up relocating the capital of the Roman Empire much farther east away from Rome. And they set up a new capital at what gets named after Emperor Constantine at Constantinople, which is today known as Istanbul. It's in Turkey. But at the time, that was a Roman Empire territory. So the capital of the Roman Empire moves, and the Western Roman Empire falls. And from there on, for the next 150 years or so, the Western Roman Empire really disintegrates. After the fall of the Roman Empire, that's when we finally get into this period of time called the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, or the medieval era. Okay, and during this time, the only real institution that is continentally recognized as having any sort of major authority is going to be the Roman Catholic Church. Europe descends into factionalism. You have these different tribes, essentially, of people who are fighting and warring against one another in the name of political influence. And then you eventually get to a period of time where we see the rise of Islam. And during this Middle Ages period, there is almost no change at all for about 900 years. There's no innovation, there's no new thoughts, there's no new inventions, really. Art techniques pretty much are stagnant until we get to the late Middle Ages. And it's a time where Europe descends kind of into this chaotic, formless place. It's not even, there's not even really a whole lot of quote unquote civilization, at least not the civilization that we understood from the Roman Empire or the age that came after the Dark Ages, which is the Renaissance and the more modern period of history. So why am I bringing this up? It's because a lot of this stuff, the ancient Greek philosophers, the ancient Roman art and architects and all of this other stuff, they get lost for a while. And Europe kind of descends into this anarchic, chaotic, intensely religious environment where there's tons of war and not a whole lot else going on. Latin, which was the language of the Roman Empire, dies. People no longer speak it. A lot of folks are illiterate. Most of the European landscape is a very dark and dangerous place. By comparison, for example, under the Roman Empire used to use the Mediterranean Sea like it was a lake. They had this thing figured out. They had huge trade networks on the Mediterranean Sea, and they were very effective. And they had colonies in North Africa and so on that they administered. After the fall of the Roman Empire, all that is gone, and now the Mediterranean Sea becomes this extraordinarily dangerous place to navigate for Europeans. There's pirates out there, and Europe really kind of goes into this period of time where, frankly, there's just not a whole lot of development. And it's not until we start to see the fragmentation of the Roman Catholic Church, starting with the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther. You may have heard of Martin Luther before. Martin Luther took and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in northern Saxony, which was a territory in Germany, what is modern day Germany. And from there, the stranglehold that the Roman Catholic Church had on European society, which informed everything. And the church was was all about keeping its power and encouraging people not to think. So all of this idea of questioning, challenging authority goes away for about 900 years until we get to the early 1500s. And that's really where the class will pick up in Unit 2, is picking up where we re-enter into a little bit more of an enlightened period of time where people start to once again question the world. And we do see some significant changes and new inventions and new styles of art and architecture. And, you know, when you look at modern day buildings like our White House or the Supreme Court or Congress Capitol building or whatever it is, okay, you'll notice that there's a lot of inspiration taken from ancient Greece and Rome. And that's because when our nation was founded in the 1700s, there was a new philosopher movement that kicked about called the Enlightenment, where once again, after over 1,000 years, really close to 1,500 years, okay, after 1,500 years of essentially kind of just stagnation, not really moving forward in any real intellectual capacity, we see a resurgence of an emphasis placed on questioning the universe and coming up with new explanations for things. And so because it was inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, the Enlightenment utilized aspects of their culture as kind of paying homage to these ancient philosophers and their contributions to thinking about the world in our own architecture. And so we see what becomes known as, for example, this neoclassical art movement, which takes ancient classical designs like those giant white pillars and domes and arches and other things like that the Romans and the Greeks used frequently. And we start to use those as inspiration to build our own governmental buildings. So obviously the White House and other buildings like that, they're nowhere near as old as ancient Greek and Roman buildings are, but they have a similar appearance to them because we were inspired by the ancient Greeks and Romans who utilized democratic institutions in their own civilizations thousands of years ago. So getting back to what we're talking about here today, the ancient major philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I'm still on slide 20, lived in Athens in the 400s and 300s BC, and they laid the foundation for philosophy for years to come. They believed that individual achievement, dignity, and worth are of great importance. One of the opinions of these ancient philosophers was that a person doesn't necessarily get their self-worth from their birthright. Okay, a person is not just automatically valued because they were from the position in society that they were born into. A person can achieve self-worth and individual achievement if they choose to become a thinker, a philosopher, a person who questions the world, a person who is individually accountable to coming up with explanations for things. Okay, thinking people have value, essentially. Let's talk about Socrates. He encouraged his students to examine their beliefs. Now, maybe you've ever heard of a Socratic seminar before. A Socratic seminar is named after Socrates. And what do you do in a Socratic seminar but ask questions? And so Socrates frequently was known for using the question and answer approach, which has been a great way of learning for a very long time. Teachers frequently, myself included, employ the Socratic method in their class when they have class discussions and they ask their students questions. You know, what do you think about this? Why do you suppose this happens? How can we do this? You know, these ideas, these just simply asking good questions is a great way to have an academic conversation and come up with new understandings about things. So it's a technique that we employ even today, thousands of years later, that was essentially pioneered by Socrates. Now, the story of Socrates is a pretty interesting one. to talk to you a little bit about the Greeks. So the Greeks were, you may have heard of like the ancient Greek gods, right? Ancient Greek gods like the god Apollo, or oh gosh, there's all sorts of them. Now I'm like forgetting their names, but there's all sorts of Greek gods and goddesses. They lived in a polytheistic society. The Greek gods were very different from the kinds of gods that that are believed in other monotheistic religions. So if we talk about like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, the God that each of those religions subscribes to is a God that is perfect, that's infallible, that is all-knowing, and so on. It's this immutably perfect divine figure. Not so for the ancient Greek gods. The ancient Greek gods were characteristically very, very flawed. And the types of stories that the Greeks would tell about the Greek gods were stories that were usually really tragic or really messed up in some way or another. And the Greeks are really known for coming up with the idea of like in plays like the tragedy, or in storytelling, the tragedy, right? Where in a tragic figure in ancient Greek literature is a figure that has all of these amazing qualities. They can be extremely, physically attractive, or they can have all of these traits of they may be very, very smart, or they may be a great warrior, or whatever. Okay, they have all of these great features about them. You would think that they have everything going for them, but they have what's known as a tragic flaw. Okay, a tragic flaw. So if you've ever heard the story of, if you've ever heard of like your Achilles tendon, okay, the story goes that the Achilles tendon is named after a Greek a Greek tragedy where this guy was a great warrior. He gets stabbed in the back of the heel, and it ends him. Okay. The story of Oedipus. Okay. The story of Oedipus, if you've never heard the story of Oedipus before, it's another extremely famous Greek tragedy where Oedipus Rex was this guy who is exiled from his town, and goes on a journey. He ends up meeting with with some sort of oracle who tells him about his future, and the oracle tells Oedipus that you will ultimately kill your father and marry your mother, and that was the prediction, the future prediction for Oedipus. So Oedipus says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do everything that I can not to let that happen. And he continues going on his journey. He ultimately runs into a guy, ends up killing this dude. And then he gets to this town, and he realizes that the town that he got to, the king has been missing. And he realizes that the guy that he killed was the king of this town. And ultimately, it was the town that he was exiled from, and he was the king's son. And he ends up marrying the queen of the town before he figures all of this out. He becomes the new king, but he doesn't realize that he's actually marrying his mother. And then because he's disgusted with himself, he ends up stabbing his eyeballs out. So again, the Greeks were known for these tragic stories, right? But these are all just stories. They're just, they're just fairy tales, essentially. The Greek gods were very flawed. All of the stories about the Greek gods, and a lot of them are backstabbing each other and all this other stuff, right? Socrates was a real human being. But what's interesting about Socrates is that he follows very much in line with these amazing Greek heroes, but tragic heroes. And so Socrates dies in what we can call a very characteristically tragic Greek way. And if you want to move on to the next slide, all right, some fun facts about Socrates. He never wrote anything down. So despite the fact that he's one of the greatest thinkers in all of ancient history, he never wrote anything down. And really the only reason that we know anything about Socrates at all, and he wasn't just completely lost to history, is because he had an equally famous student towards the very end of his life named Plato. And Plato did write things down. And he's told stories about Socrates and the kinds of things of Socrates that Socrates said and did. And Socrates was known as one of the wisest men of all time. It was actually rumored that Plato had ultimately had an affair with Socrates' wife. We don't know if that's exactly true or not, but it is a historical rumor. But here's what ends up happening. The Greek gods were very, very highly valued in Greek culture. And what Socrates would do is he'd stand on the top of this hill, and he'd be philosophizing. Okay, he'd be teaching and asking questions, and he would have people come up and listen to him. And Socrates was a well-known figure in Athens. He was a relatively famous guy in his time. So a lot of people knew Socrates, and he was very vocal. And being that his job was to be a philosopher and question the natural world around him, all right, one of the things that ends up happening is he starts to question the existence of the Greek gods. Well, in Greek society, this was a big no-no. Okay, you didn't question the existence of the Greek gods. They were very kind of sacred to Greek culture. But he starts questioning them and suggests that perhaps the Greek gods don't exist. Now, normally, if somebody was to do this, they probably would have just been brought in and killed. It would have been a very short trial, and they probably would have just sentenced them to death. All right, because it's still a pretty brutal culture that they're living in there. However, Socrates is not just any ordinary dude. And so they pull Socrates in. They say, Socrates, look, you've been asking some questions that you shouldn't be asking. All right. And we tell you what, how about this? Go home, think about it over the weekend, come in next week, and maybe you'll change your mind by then and stuff. And Socrates says, I won't. I'm not going to change my mind. My job as a philosopher is to question the world around me, and that means that all questions are worth asking. Well, they pull him in next week. They say, well, Socrates, you've had the weekend to think about it. Have you decided to cool down a little bit and retract your questions, retract what you said about disgracing the gods? And Socrates says, no, I haven't. He says something to the effect of, if I was to retract what I said, I may as well retract everything I've ever said. Because to take back something that I don't believe in, all right, undermines all of the work that I've ever done my entire life as a philosopher, which is my inherent belief to question the world around me. And they say, are you sure? And he says, yes. So they say, well, you know what the punishment is for that? It's death. And he says, I am aware. And so the way that he dies is he is forced to commit suicide by drinking something called hemlock poison. It comes from a poisonous plant, and you put the hemlock leaves into essentially like a tea, and you drink it and you die. And he was found guilty of corrupting the city's youth by questioning the existence of the Greek gods. And it's a rather tragic way to die, because Socrates died believing in something when he technically didn't have to die. But at the same time, for him, the punishment of living and not being able to do what his duty is as a philosopher, to question everything, would have been perhaps a punishment worse than death. And so this is a rather interesting story about Socrates and the importance of his position as an intellectual figure in history. As he gets older, we can move on to the next one. We're now on slide 23. The next major philosopher that we're going to be talking about today, his name is Plato, and he was a student of Socrates. He certainly did, Arnav. And frankly, there's something to be said about that. You know, there is something to be said about that. He died living his passion, and he died with honor. You know, he died with dignity. He died not forsaking his existence to the arbitrariness of the social expectation that he should not question things. All right. So, you know, it's kind of honorable. So Plato was a student of Socrates. Plato was a young man, and Socrates was already quite elderly, all right, by the time that they meet. All right. And he wrote a very famous work called The Republic. And in The Republic, what Plato suggested was that that the government, the Athenian government in particular, but that all governments should be run by the wisest people in society, not the richest people in society. In other words, Plato believed that if the only thing that was necessary in order to obtain political power was wealth, that this inevitably would result in corruption. And there's a lot of evidence throughout all of history to suggest that this is very, very true. And so rather, Plato suggested we don't want the richest people making all the decisions, because if we have rich people in power making decisions, they're going to make decisions that benefit themselves, and they have a likelihood of turning into tyrants, okay? People who exercise power through their wealth and create situations that make it increasingly difficult for other people to enter into the political realm. So he called these folks philosopher kings. He thought that kings should themselves be philosophers, that they should be thinking, that they should be questioning, that they should be that they should somehow have an education to be experts in statesmanship, okay, experts in politics, experts in things outside the realm of politics. He didn't just want the oligarchs, the wealthy or the aristocratic nobles to be the ones making decisions based purely on wealth or birthright. He doesn't like the idea of monarchs and tyrants, okay? Monarchs and tyrants to Plato were very, very dangerous and opened themselves up to corruption. And as I said, we can look all throughout history at any number of different examples of single power rule. One of the questions that you guys had on your first assignment was what is one of the downfalls of having a monarch? Well, a monarch makes government easy because there's never any argument about anything. The monarchs just do whatever they want to do. And so, you know, decision-making processes are very simple. Democratic governments have a lot of bickering, a lot of arguing. Why? Because people don't get along. There's a lot of, you have to compromise with people from the other side of the political aisle. And so democracy's tough. It's hard. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time. It doesn't move quickly. All right. But a monarchy, although an advantage of it is that it might move quickly, the disadvantage of it is that you have a single person in power whose power is unchecked by other authorities. And that's really problematic, because what that results in is that they could really make some very dangerous decisions that could have an impact on their entire kingdom, and really affect the lives of the people who live under that king. And you know, perhaps get involved in wars, or perhaps create situations where it's really unfair and unjust for the people, or what have you. Okay, so Plato doesn't like the idea of single rule. He likes the idea of having a lot of thinkers coming into the governmental process and not have their position in government be solely determined by how much money they make. All right. One of the things that Plato said is, those things which are beautiful are also difficult. That's a really great quote. And I want you to think about it for a second. Those things which are beautiful are also difficult. Think about that quote for a second. One of the things that I increasingly began to appreciate as I have gotten older now is that all of the things that are worth something in life, all of the things that are meaningful in terms of personal achievement, individual identity, are the things that you really kind of have to work for. For example, if you had to, it probably sounds like a pretty good deal if you could just go to school and be guaranteed to get A's. But if you ask yourself, how much would you really get out of your education if you knew that no matter what you did, you showed up every day and got an A? All right. You might think that'd be awesome because it would open up these opportunities to you. But at the end of the day, you'd get done with your education and you'd say, I never really pushed myself. I never really tried that hard. I never really got much out of my education because there was no struggle, right? When I went back and I got my master's degree in history, I could have gone back to an online college and gotten my master's degree from Grand Canyon University and gotten a, education master's and gotten the same pay raise, and I would have made the same amount of money and whatever else. I didn't want to do that. The reason I didn't want to do it is because I knew it wouldn't be personally fulfilling. I wanted to challenge myself. The struggle was what made getting the education worth it in the first place. All right. So when Plato says those things which are beautiful are also difficult, he's making the claim that a lot of the times the things that bring people meaning are also the things that people had to struggle through in order to triumph over, right? And that could be any number of different things, okay? It could be getting a job and saving up money so that you can buy yourself a car, okay? Or it might be going to college and getting a degree and then getting a professional, title or position in society somewhere. Or it could be starting your own business, okay? Whatever it is, there's all sorts of different ways that this quote can manifest, all right? But one of the ways that he's referring to is with democracy. And when we think about the democratic process, it is rife with struggle, okay? It is filled with struggle. It's difficult, okay? There was a leader in Britain, his name was Winston Churchill during the Second World War. You may have heard his name before. He was the Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. Winston Churchill said something to the effect of democracy is... what is it? I'm trying to think of the exact quote. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others that have been tried. Now think about that quote for a second. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others which have been tried. What he's trying to say there is that the process of democracy is anything but easy. It's miserable, frankly, okay? It's difficult, there's a lot of fighting, and especially in our modern times, we're living in an era where the nation politically is more polarized than it's perhaps ever been going back to the foundation of the country, all right? There is something to be said, though, about the beauty of the struggle, as implied by Plato. I would rather have a polarized, difficult, democratic system in place than to live under a tyrant. And I believe Plato would have very much agreed with me on that. Now, Plato ended up going into voluntary exile. He left his native city immediately following the execution of Socrates because, he was obviously dismayed by it. And in Syracuse, he ends up getting sold into slavery. But Plato ultimately ended up raising 3,000 drachmas, which was the currency that they used at the time, through his friends to buy back his freedom, and he ended up returning to Athens shortly thereafter in 387 BC. When he got back to Athens, he established a brand new school called the Academy. And in 386, Plato purchased a recreation grove dedicated to the god Academus, which you've probably heard before. And this became the location of his school. So that whole word academic or academia or academy all comes from the Greek god Academus. And it was like the Greek god of knowledge, right? So this is how kind of Plato goes about living his life. And then as one of the students that comes through the academy late in Plato's life. So although Socrates was the teacher of Plato and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, Aristotle never knew Socrates because they were many, many generations apart. Plato was already, again, a very elderly man by the time that he took on probably his best known student, Aristotle. So Aristotle had some different views on things. Like any good teacher, like any good student, he took his teacher's ideas and thought about them and critiqued them and came up with new innovations in his ideas. And so he examined the world of the nature of the world through human belief, thought, and knowledge. And Aristotle was very much of the belief that laws were needed to maintain order and stability in society, and that everyone has to follow those laws regardless of what position they are in within society. Doesn't matter if they're at the top of the government, doesn't matter if they're a lowly peasant, okay? That everybody should be, what's the word that I'm looking for? Tied to the law, okay? That the laws apply to all. All right, and that when the laws are broken, regardless of who you are, that the punishment for those for breaking the law for those folks needs to be the same. Okay, so citizens and government both need to follow the laws, and the idea is obviously that you could technically have a lawless society, but it's a pretty difficult society to live in. And laws allow for structure, and they hold people accountable. And people, let's face it, aren't perfect, right? People are going to make mistakes. People are heavily influenced by emotion and all sorts of things. And so when you have laws in place, it allows for keeping society accountable when individuals start acting disorderly. Okay, Aristotle had a very great quote. You'll probably see this quote again sometime. And I'll read the quote for you, and I want you to think about it a little bit here. He says, and I'm now on slide 26 of the PowerPoint. Aristotle says, "He who trusts any man with supreme power gives it to a wild beast. For such his appetite sometimes makes him. Passion influences those in power, even the best of men. But law is reason without desire." Okay? Law is reason without desire. In other words, the laws should be indiscriminate. Laws should never discriminate, okay, against people of a particular social standing. The laws should be blind. In other words, the laws should apply to everyone the same, no matter who you are. That's what Aristotle is suggesting in this quote here. And in particular, the person who is going to be most likely to flout the law, to step around the law, to break the law and not have to face consequences for it, is going to be a tyrant, a single ruler at the top of society who can make any decision and whose authority is unchecked. And even when you get good leaders in those positions, even if you have a particularly capable, smart, charismatic, whatever figure in that position, even the best of men are influenced by their appetite for power. And that leads them to be prone to becoming corrupt, and that leads them to be prone to breaking the law without consequence. And Aristotle fundamentally disagrees with that. He felt a single ruler or king would invariably, at one point or another, become corrupt and break the laws. It would be very unlikely that anyone was able to get through that, being in that position without doing so. And so, important idea for the foundation of democratic societies. Moving on to the last basically a couple of slides that we're going to be covering today, and then I'll be uploading the assignment. Legacy of Greece. Okay, when we zoom the camera out and we take a look at the big picture of what did Greece afford to us? Okay, well, it was, the legacy of Greece, inspired by philosophers to use intelligence and reason to describe the world using natural laws. When we look at laws and how we make laws, we try to make laws that are representative of the needs of the people. Okay, that we make laws that fit with how human nature works best, right? If you think about some of the most basic laws that we have, it's a crime to murder, it's a crime to rob people, it's a crime to whatever, okay? It's behaviors that are at the root of it all disintegrating of society, right? If we were just living in a society where murder or theft or whatever else reigned free, it would be a very difficult society to live in. These are things that objectively society can't function if every day you have to worry about going outside and being killed, or going outside and being mugged. A proper society can't work that way, right? And so the idea is you make laws that are reflective of human nature, okay, that try to keep people's life within society and in relation to others around them, free of chaos, free of trauma, okay. And another thing, legacy of Greece, they developed direct democracy so that citizens could participate in government for the first time. And also, the Greeks were one of the first inspirations for having three branches of government. They divided their government into a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And we do the same thing in our government today. The idea being that none of these branches alone runs the entire show, that each of these branches has certain authorities delegated to them, and that the other branches keep the other branches in check. All right, checks and balances is what that is referred to. So the legislative branch is the part that writes laws, the executive branch is the part that carries out or enforces the laws, and then the judicial branch is the part that settles disputes about the law. If there's an extenuating circumstance, all right, where there's a disagreement about how the law should be implemented, then the judicial branch settles those disagreements, and we do the same thing in our society as well. Real quick, American democracy. Am I still connected? It says my sorry, I think I disconnected for a second there. Hopefully I'm back now. It said my connection was unstable. The internet's been a little wonky here at the school today. So how is Athenian democracy different from American democracy? And if you look on the next slide there, you're going to see a Venn diagram, okay, on slide 29. And you'll see that there are some similarities between the two, but there are also some distinct differences. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. There are also some distinct differences between Athenian and American democracy. So I would encourage you to examine that Venn diagram within the PowerPoint on slide 29 to give you a good idea of some of the things that you could include in one of the assignments that I'm going to be putting up for you shortly here on Canvas. So that is going to conclude the lecture portion of what I have for you today. But what I am going to do next, don't sign off yet. What I am going to do next is I'm going to be putting up an assignment pertaining to the Greek philosophers on Canvas, okay? And then I'm also going to be putting up, just to let you know, today is Tuesday. On Thursday, okay, on Thursday, my sister is getting married on Saturday in Minneapolis, which is my hometown. And if I didn't mention this last week, I just want to make clear, on Thursday, there will be a lecture and there will be an assignment. However, Thursday and Friday will be the only 2 times this entire semester, unless I somehow become ill or something like that, heaven forbid, that the lecture will not be conducted live. Okay, there will still be school on those days though, but just as it would be as though I was there. Okay, but I will actually be on a plane flying out to Minneapolis to go to my sister's wedding on Thursday. So the assignment that you're going to have on Thursday is going to be pertaining to Athens, Athenian democracy, Roman democracy, and so on. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Rome on Thursday. So that's why I'm pointing out that part of that PowerPoint there, slide 29, because that Venn diagram is going to help assist you on your assignment. Okay, one other thing before I go, don't sign off yet. I do need to take attendance. And today I want to know the way I'm going to take attendance. And remember, if you don't have your name in your actual YouTube, name or whatever, or username, please make sure that you include your actual name so that I know who I'm dealing with, okay, when I do attendance, because it's very important. So here's what I want to know for you today. The question that I want you to answer is, for attendance, tell me if you could go on any dream vacation location, tell me where would you go on your dream vacation? Type it in the chat. Vietnam, Hawaii, Malaysia, wow. Italy, good choice. Good choices. Bora Bora, India, Alaska, nice. I have a friend who just got back from Alaska. He said it was beautiful. Australia, a nice hotel in Canada. Stay out of Canada in February, unless you're looking for the cold. Area 51 or Antarctica, that's cool. Verona, Italy, cool. Hawaii, Alaska, Netherlands. So I'd go to France, Germany, Japan, nice. England, excellent. Yeah, I took a trip to Italy 2 years ago. One of the most amazing experiences of my entire life. It was phenomenal. Okay, I like absolutely phenomenal. So I strongly encourage you guys at some point in your lives to travel. There's really no better experience than seeing the entire world and what it has to offer. It's awesome. Amsterdam, cool. Nice. All right. Very, very good. I think if that is everyone, go to the UK. Anything we need to know about textbook pickup today for this class? You're welcome to pick up the textbook. We probably won't use it a whole lot. If we ever do need to use the textbook, I have one here, and I would take pictures of the pages that we would use and put it up onto Canvas for you. So if you want a textbook to be reading, I always encourage that. The textbook, you can take it out and read it and follow along with what we're doing. But it's not necessary for the purposes of getting the assignments done. And if it ever was, I would make sure that you had access to it. So don't worry too much about that. All right, folks. Well, if that's everyone, I'm going to log off here, and I'll be going over to Canvas right now and putting up the assignment for you. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be uploaded within the next few minutes here. Thanks so much for tuning in today, folks, and have a wonderful rest of the day.